Hello everyone, this is Marlena Ramchandran from Canada InfoNet. I'm a mentoring coach and an employment counselor with the Canada InfoNet pre-arrival program. Welcome to today's webinar, which is focused on the topic, the future of jobs in banking. Before we get started, I just wanted to take you through some of the webinar housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded and the length will be approximately 45 minutes. All participant lines are muted and there will be a question answer session at the end of the webinar. So while you have questions, you may want to make a note of them and you can type your questions in the questions window. You will see that window on your screen. And please take time to complete the post webinar survey towards the end. We will send an email reminder as well. Your feedback is very important to us as that helps us organize and plan other webinars in future. The recording of this webinar will be posted on JVS Toronto's blog. And last but not the least, we are hosting from home, so please bear with us. A brief about JVS Toronto services. We have 9 locations in Greater Toronto area, including downtown Toronto, North York, Markham, Scarborough, and Etobicoke. So whichever centers near to you, please feel free to reach out to us. We have a range of programs for unemployed and underemployed individuals, including job seekers who've been laid off, recent graduates, persons with disability, internationally training professionals, youth, etc. And yes, during COVID-19, we continue to support our clients province-wide with online services. Our employment experts meet with you one-on-one to determine your specific employment needs. Our two major services, we have Canada InfoNet program, which is a pre-arrival program intended for internationally trained individuals relocating to Canada within the next 12 months with an approved Canadian immigrant visa. Through this program, we help you with in-depth job search preparation, online mentoring, achieving success in the Canadian workplace, and help you build employer connections. Our Employment Ontario services, which are post-arrival services, which are offered to you once you land in Canada, include help with variety of job search, job matching, job development resume, LinkedIn, career exploration, financial employment support, and more. And we also help you to clarify career interests, skills, and opportunities. We help you build confidence at job interviews and attract job offers from employers. So that's a range of services available to you. Please feel free to reach out to us based on what your needs are, and we are always happy to help you. I'd now like to welcome our speaker of the day, Rajeev Chip, to take this forward. Rajeev, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining today. I'm very grateful for you spending this next 45 minutes or so listening to really what is an extraordinary period of time, looking at the future of the workforce, particularly in finance and more specifically within banking. So if you can move to the first slide. Just by way of a quick introduction, I've been in the industry for over 25 years. I've had the privilege of working across various continents. Started in North America, in New York, Toronto. I'm actually based, for those of you who don't know, in Hong Kong. So today I'm coming live to you from Hong Kong. So a 12-hour difference. Having said that, I've been very connected with the Toronto job market, with JVS. I've had the opportunity to work with JVS for a few years now, and would love to share some of the trends within banking today. In my current capacity, I'm the COO of a large institution within the investor sales and relationship management space. I've also, I'm passionate and enthusiastic about the business management arena, and I've had training at the University of Toronto, and I understand the Canadian system as well. For those of you pursuing additional education, whether it's online or not, I'll touch a little bit on that within the presentation as well. And I think the one thing that I'd love to, if there's a message to convey, which I have a section talking about networking as well, is being able to be associated with various associations. And for those of you interested within the financial services or banking space, there are a lot of opportunities, both international associations, local associations that are very much connected within the entire financial services ecosystem. So, I've had some experience within ASIFMA, which is essentially the Asian Securities Financial Markets Association, and also various fintech, big tech, big data associations as well here in Asia. If we can move to the next slide. So I thought I'd start, today's session with some initial food for thought. Usually I would put out a poll question if it was a live session and get a raise of hands on this. Now that we're delivering this through online content, I thought I'd put a few points out here, specifically in regards to banking, and then we can talk a little bit about some of the skill sets from my experience that I see would definitely be beneficial. So from a banking perspective, if you look at where banks have been, since the global financial crisis back in 2008, it's a very different scenario today. We have stronger balance sheets. We've got banks which are much well capitalized. Liquidity equation is much more different from what it was back during the great financial crisis, in 2008. So that is clearly a difference. What are we really learning as we go through this period, this very interesting and extraordinary period? Reputation and purpose are really increasingly important for our customers. A survey and a strategy survey and study that was done by PwC mentioned that 83% of customers actually believe the importance of banks is so much that they really have a moral obligation to help society, particularly during these times. And being part of a large bank, a large global bank, we certainly see that internally within our competition. Other market participants are also doing the same. Also, the other food for thought is really when you look at some of the leaders, the best leaders, will recognize some of these sound strategic decisions. The point really here is that things are changing. There's a lot of uncertainty, and things that may have occurred 3 months ago may no longer make actually sense today. So it is really moving at a pace which is moving pretty quickly, which introduces this element of uncertainty as well. And really where we're seeing where the win is going to be is banks that are delivering the most complete customer but more digitized experience with the customer's mind at the forefront will be the biggest winners. So the concept of digitization and that customer experience certainly is still, from an investment standpoint, at the forefront of banks. Some more food for thought in the next slide as well, just in terms of teeing up some of the themes. One of the things that is quite evident is, and I use the term supercharged, but the concept of utilizing technology, becoming digital by default, we've seen that across the banking space, across the financial services space. So whether it's a customer for online banking, whether it's looking at utilizing web and live chat for doing meetings such as these, looking at mobile banking, all of that, it's become somewhat of a default. And what we're also seeing is some of our clients who are smaller clients who really were not, as I guess within the life cycle of digitization further along, have been really forced to to move in that direction. Simplification, repricing, focused more on fee-based income, particularly given the low interest rate environment, innovative solutions that are coming out of that. We're seeing that our clients are demanding it, and the marketplace is demanding it as well globally. I think the other thing which will likely show up even in Q3, Q4 of this year is, as some of these large institutions are in the lending businesses, they're preparing for some credit losses. So I think the story here is that it's not smooth sailing. There's more pain perhaps to come. So just being aware of that, particularly those of us who are looking for careers in banking, it's going to look a little different. And as a result of that, there's also a big focus on costs, concentrating on costs, being clear in terms of where do we want to play, where do these big companies, big financial services, where do they want to win, what's the purpose. I think those are some of the good questions perhaps that will come out and get teased out of this with much more focus. So if we move to the next slide. So again, these previous points were more food for thought, and the question is, so what? So, what are these key questions to ask ourselves, given that we're in this crisis today? Do we really understand the needs and expectations of our clients today? I think particularly if you're looking at the banking industry, I'm within the investment banking space and the capital market space. That space is changing, and whether it's servicing institutional clients, whether it's servicing corporate clients, there is going to be a shift. Can we adapt our mindset? So internally, what we're seeing, even within our own bank, is the support of talent, which is more geared towards taking initiatives, what we're referring to as growth champions, and looking to deliver, looking at agile ways to move quickly, despite given the actual headwinds. And that's really as a result of this new set of client demands, given the low interest rate environment, looking for innovative ideas. We need individuals and talent which really tailors to that. Are we able to solidify our competitive position? Now, I use the term fintechs and tech fins, and this is something I sort of made up. But what I mean by that is, even pre-crisis, really what we were seeing was the fintechs were getting more involved within the ecosystem of the traditional banks. And if I'm a betting man, basically looking at some of these fintech companies, it's really a matter of time, and in many cases it's already happening, where they're joining at the hip with some of the larger traditional banks to engage in initiatives. And I think the idea there is that some of these banks have the platform, but the actual intellect with respect to the technology space would still lie within the fintech. So there's this collaboration that's already been seen. And I think without that, given that there are so many unknowns, there's likelihood to be those who are going to be left behind. No question about that. So if we move to the next slide, now of course there's many skills that are important. What I thought, the three that I thought I would cherry pick is the whole concept of this new skills for the distance economy. We've looked at again the digitization aspect of pre-crisis, moving a lot of our services, electronifying a lot of our services, and you look at classic mortgage refinance processing. There's a lot of digitization around that. There's cross-training around that as a result of work that's being shifted away from humans to machines. But I think the one interesting aspect that's come out these past several months is some of our clients, it's this whole concept of empathy and distressed clients. and how we use some of the cognitive side to be aware of that as we deal with our customers in order to retain them. And I would even argue that that's a space from a career perspective or from a job opportunity perspective to be looked at as well, and is being discussed as well. There's clearly, number two, imbalances in the whole supply-demand equation with regards to talent. Once again, the expectation is that clients, those who are slightly better equipped in terms of
Rajiv, hi, this is Marlena. We can't hear you. It seems you've gone inaudible. Would you mind checking?
is that better?
Yes, it's better now. So you were talking
Okay,
about empathy as distressed clients, and that's when we stopped hearing you. So you may want to get
thank you.
started from there. Thanks.
Thank you. So the second piece is really around the imbalances in the entire supply and demand talent, and really building off the whole concept of digitization. There will be those clients who are not as far along with regards to the technology space in terms of the life cycle. They haven't adapted as quickly, and they are now in really being forced to do so. And some of the large tech companies, the FANG as we refer them to, the Facebooks, the Apples, the Netflix, etc., the Googles of the world, they've set up digital talent marketplaces as well as platforms to address some of these inequalities between the supply and demand talent equation. The Bill Gates Foundation as well, they've gone and set up something very similar. So we're seeing that is playing out. And then point number three, really looking at the changes to the supply chain. And those were the days where we were looking at offshoring. Now, given the environment that we're working in, the challenges and headwinds, even within the financial services industry, there's discussion around moving the jobs onshore. So there is a from a skill trending perspective, some of these changes which are quite different from what we've seen historically. If we move to the next slide. So what are some of the what I call critical success factors, particularly when you look at the technology aspect? Fintechs, instead of using the term competition, I think embracing co-opetition is probably something that we've obviously seen in the past several years. This is nothing new. However, I think, again, I keep using the terms supercharge. Really, this situation that we are in within the crisis has sort of supercharged the engagement with existing ecosystems within the technology space between fintech companies and the banks. And that's something that even in the last 3 to 6 months, we've seen it where we're working very closely with fintech companies to come up with some of the solutions, particularly around some of the risk metrics which our managers use to make decisions, and how fintech companies have helped some of the banks do that as well. The other area very important, and really this is, again, it's not new, something that post 2008, after the financial crisis, there was a huge focus in banking, in financial services, around regulation and the change to regulation. Whether you had the Volcker rule, whether you had various Dodd-Frank initiatives that were pushed through compliance, through various regulatory bodies, all of that has really looked at regulatory initiatives as key. So today, fintechs may be flying under the radar, I think the key difference as we start looking at the future of finance is the regulatory tolerance, and it's quite evident, and it's a global phenomenon. It's going to be very low when looking at not being in compliant to anti-money laundering, credit-related disparate impact, know your client, just to name a few of them. So I think regulation really is going to be the key swing factor at the end in terms of how fintech disruption really plays out. It's already out there. I mean, a lot of you may have heard the terms of regtech and souptech and anything that has a prefix before tech, but regulation certainly is front of mind for most of the market participants in this space. If we can move forward, please. So this is something actually that was put out by McKinsey. The banks are focused on building many different types of digital capabilities. I just thought it would be quite interesting if we could just click. I think I have sort of boxed a few items. So the first one really looking at analytics. So we've got 6 sort of pillars here under the data-driven digital insights, looking at the whole concept of analytics and data and big data and the infrastructure behind that. I think that's again an area where there's certainly going to be even more reliance on having robust analytics to be able to navigate and be able to put some of this information in front of key decision makers. The second pillar really is whether you're looking at the client-centric experience design phase, or you're looking at the actual journey. I think at the end of the day, albeit different forms of delivery to the client, it is really, if there's one pillar here that's probably the most important, it probably is around the customer centricity. At the industry level also, I've been involved with several customer-centric initiatives. Whether it's know your customer, whether it's AML related, that's definitely something that I would say very, very highly ranked. And then within the same context, the whole concept of marketing, it's looking at also the focus on where the client is. I mentioned earlier some of the clients that we've been dealing with, frankly, have struggled with regards to technology as a whole. So this whole concept also within the marketing space is where are your clients in that life cycle, and then targeting the marketing, the digital marketing aspect, depending on your client. So it's not a cookie cutter approach. And then not to read through everything, but again, it's all the services are client centric. We're looking at obviously the ability to be more agile, and this kind of goes back to my previous point about talent, where a lot of the banks are looking for growth-minded champions, and it's this sort of the next generation, not only of technology, but those who are going to deliver it as well. It's that growth mindset as well. And then I was struggling with the last pillar. I think I sort of circled all 3, which is really the digital talent management, organizational governance, and then the innovative test and learn culture. I think all of that really are the enablers to get these 5 pillars in action. So that's sort of from looking at the focus of where big banks and big financial services will look at building their capabilities and building upon. As I mentioned, it's not something that's new, but I think a lot of the focus is really going to be within these 5, 6 pillars that we've gone through. So the next slide. So looking at reskilling, a couple of items that I called out here is identifying skills recovery. And that really is very bespoke to the organization, the different type of banks that are out there. So understanding and building employee skill sets with the new business model, I think that's what you're going to start seeing with the banks. There isn't a cookie cutter approach in terms of bridging skills gap. It has to be quite bespoke to the type of clients that we're servicing, the type of roles that are out there. The other thing which is quite resonating, which came up at an industry committee meeting last week as well, is this whole concept of uncertainty. And where some of the success stories have been shared have been in cases where, you know, we've started as quickly as possible, we continue to test, and then we reiterate, because there will be mistakes. But the idea, I think the key point is starting ASAP. And you know, that's something that resonates with quite a few initiatives that we've been looking at. And then the last one, or the item number 5, is looking at really thinking as a small entrepreneur. Especially with some of the banks tend to be, in the Canadian banks tend to be rather large. So essentially the idea here is being part of a change agent mentality. You're a small entrepreneur to have a big impact. And last but not least, especially during this type of environment, is, you know, treasuring the learning budgets, or else you know, management knows that that we'll regret it. So being able to value talent, being able to develop people, I think that's certainly something that still continues to be very much at the forefront. In fact, I would argue, given the time that we're in, there's even more opportunity to do that. So if we move to the next slide. So I won't spend too much time here, but this is sort of just building off the previous slide in terms of safeguarding the banking workforce as we think about post-COVID. So if we could just click on the next few, which I've, I think, boxed a couple. So I put it in this sort of order, not necessarily starting with microscaling, but what I'm seeing is really upskilling, you know, expanding the nature of the existing roles, and understanding where some of the gaps are and the new skills and activities that will really become part of this new normal. There's quite a bit of focus on that, and I actually think that there'll be quite a bit of opportunities from a job creation perspective, even in that space. You know, reskilling, you know, basically retraining employees, you know, given their experience, given a lot of them already know how to navigate within their organizations, but there will be a reskilling. There's definitely a space around hiring new talent, which is happening as well. And particularly whereas, you know, we expand hiring in roles where with remote work opportunities, there's demand that has peaked. Gone, I think, are those days where there was a belief that a particular role had to be in a particular physical location. I think now we've been challenged to test that, you know, that could actually happen online elsewhere. And then sort of going back to the first box, really, microscaling is, you know, expanding employee skill set without really changing the roles. Yes, I think that is true. You will see that in certain type of small businesses, or in certain type of work where we're servicing more manual activities. I personally haven't quite seen it, but definitely this is something that you know, is part of this so-called safeguarding. So we can move to the next slide. So here, you know, I thought I'd take a little bit of a pause. I know that we've got questions coming up closer to the end, so I'll just continue on. But really, the idea here is, you know, shifting, if we can just go back, you know, shifting your perspective is, it's really more powerful than being smart, I think, especially given the current situation everyone is in. Everyone is being challenged to look at a different paradigm. It is a paradigm shift. It is a different way of thinking about not only clients, not only the nature of the business, but also, I think, well-being. I think well-being is a big part of this. It is a people's business. So if you move to the next slide. So what I thought would be interesting is just providing maybe 1 or 2 case studies of things that we've seen in the industry as well that may prove to be helpful and put some perspective. I've talked a little bit about this whole turbocharge concept of acceleration of digitization. So if we move to the next slide. So I just wanted to, I guess, put into perspective, and no pun intended, I'm sure a lot of you already are very familiar with robotic process automation and machine learning. But some of the things that, so when I speak here, I represent hopefully some of my colleagues within the financial services industry, being part of quite a few different associations. But I look at the life cycle over the last 5 or so years, and we were back in 2015 um, as part of the whole robotic process automation, or RPA as it's called, an area where the processes had few variations. So we were looking at technology, but where we wanted to see there was the maximum impact was some of the more manual processes where there were a large number of steps involved, and essentially we build certain rules as part of technology to perform those steps, using simple rules, and rules that would then automate those processes. As we move forward, we sort of moved on to something what we call sort of autonomics or machine learning, and there again, a lot of the processes were manual, but this is the first time we started looking at this concept called cognitive decision making. And that was essentially, where the human decision making comes in place. So algorithms have been built, and we see that particularly in the job that I'm in, where I work very closely with traders and salespeople, and the questions become, given the market volatility and the speed at which information is received, the need for digitizing and creating algorithms to come up with a desired outcome. That has been definitely embedded in a lot of the in a lot of the computing power that we use today in distributing capital market products, in providing best execution for our clients as well. So that's something that we've got large technology teams that support it. We've got PhDs who essentially focus just on algorithms. So that was the period, and I would say we are now sort of in a period where we could, I think people would argue, and I definitely don't claim to be an expert in this field at all, but people would still argue whether we are in the artificial intelligence phase or we're still sort of in machine learning. But for sure, processes are much more complex. There's high level of human intervention required as well, and data is unstructured, and there's not only one set of rules, which is simple, but it's multidimensional as well. So we've sort of come into a phase of increased complexity, and that's sort of the life cycle, and I see that continuing and being a big focus within the banking space, particularly in for those of you interested in the capital market space, certainly will continue. Next slide, please. So I won't go through this in detail. I'm cognizant of the time as well. But what I wanted to call out is some of the things that
Raju, we can't hear you again.
The reality really is processes that existed within big organizations in banks and financial services, where there were large departments that were essentially performing roles, providing, for example, what I call first line.
Sorry, Rajiv, this is Marlena. Your voice seems to fade in and fade out, so would you mind repeating what you're saying? We still can't hear you. Can't hear you, Rajiv. Hi everyone, we'll just try and figure this out. Just bear with us meanwhile. We're going to send him an email. Rajiv, if you could, we can't hear you, so I'm not sure if you can hear me, but we've sent you an email as well.
Point number three, which is looking at processes where data needs to be typed into various systems, and classic examples in banks is when performing transactions, there are usually confirmations and paper trails of those transactions. A lot of that has really been automated through artificial intelligence. And what that has also done is it shifted employees from doing one type of role to redeploying them to more value-added functions as well. Next slide, please. So future of careers in banking. So sort of building up the food for thought, talked a little bit about some of the gaps within the skills. I talked a little bit about the critical success factors as well, and just presented very, very briefly some of the case studies that we've seen both internally within the banks and also with our clients. I thought I'd spend just a few minutes around the future of careers as we see it in banking. So the next slide. So this first slide is really given my experiences in capital markets, and again, apologize if I'm only speaking to those who are interested in that particular space, but I'll just quickly mention a few areas which I think continue to be real strategic areas for the industry. So I would say the simplification of processes, looking at the productivity of trading, of salespeople, looking at multi trade processing, multi products, so across product lines. How do we automate? How do we create consistencies around trading strategies, around systems, having instead of having an entire spaghetti diagram when you're looking at how technology is aligned across products, simplifying it. I think that's the one from the first bullet point. The key takeaway is simplification using technology. That is real focus. The second point is around becoming comfortable with data. I think at the end of the day, data analytics, their fancy terms, their fancy programs, the Pythons, the data flames, etc. I think at the end of the day, roles that are going to be created or employees who have to retrain have to become very comfortable, not necessarily in computer programming, but this concept of having data, being able to understand how to analyze data as well. I think there's going to be a big need towards strategy. So business development initiatives, partnering with business development initiatives from a technology standpoint, and being able to, particularly with the larger banks, where we continue to see verticals where one part of the organization is doing something completely in silo of the other. There's going to be this big push towards the partnership. Electronification, most of these larger organizations have innovation labs, and in terms of product design, in terms of engineering, leveraging that as much as possible. This is where actually I use the term fintech and techfin. I think these innovation labs at the traditional banks are more likely to be able to actually join at the hip with some of the fintechs. And then again, working with people. I think at the end of the day, we can talk about all these digitization, but at the end of the day, it is about working with the salespeople, with the traders, in terms of execution. Next slide, please. So my 2 cents, again, I have more than 2 cents, but I thought if I was to distill it into 3 simple concepts, given where we are today, given a very different new norm that banking is presenting from a career perspective, being someone in financial services for the last 25 years, I think the ability to unlearn and relearn or learn sort of at the same pace in a consistent manner, given the amount of change that we're seeing, is probably something to take on. Broadening exposure to various domains within banking, I think that's always probably another word would be networking. Is never a better time to do that. And then building on core competency that you already have, and then enriching that with this peripheral competency, which sort of goes to the first bullet point around learning. I think that curiosity and these opportunities to learn, particularly the new skills that the difference or the imbalance between supply and demand of skill sets, focusing on personal development in that space is another area of focus. Next slide, please. And sort of as we get to the close of the presentation, I thought I'd just put in a few things to be aware of as those of you who are interviewing or looking for roles, looking for new roles. How do we actually navigate this new way of job interviews, of searching for jobs? I thought I'd give my 2 cents. I do represent a talent and diversity. I sit on one of the committees here in Asia. It's a global committee as well. I'm also on the Rotman International Advisory Board, which is at the University of Toronto. We talk a lot about talent as well. And then my own experience at the firm that I work for. So I think, dealing with the empathy aspect is very, very important. I think it's very important, and we see a lot of the leading banks, a lot of the organizations are providing remarkable support, whether it's flex time, but it's the whole concept of dealing with grief over loss, denial, anxiety, all of that, I think is definitely something that is at the forefront. Also accepting, as you go out, for those of you who are looking for a new role, you may have some ambition in terms of the type of role that you had in mind. I think the quicker we accept that what we were planning for is going to look very, very different, or is just not going to look like what we were planning for, I think that is a reality. And the key thing really is to reorganize. We need to map our skills and also do some research on the organizations that you're looking to target and anticipate that. Talent acquisition, I think the positives there is the reality is a lot of people, a lot of the seniors are not traveling anymore. There's an opportunity to network. I think that's a great way for us to be able to tap into that reality. I think the hiring process is also looking very virtual. It was looking virtual prior to the crisis. I think now even more so. A lot of the human resource and talent and development areas of banks are certainly looking at that. The physical environment, let's face it, it's no longer about the millennials' physical environment, it's about everyone. And a number of hiring managers are frankly uncomfortable hiring individuals without physically seeing them as part of an interview process. It's just being aware of some of that. And I think, my third sort of bullet point is around when you do get into, you have an opportunity to interview. I think these first impressions is very different from being in person at an interview. Virtual interviews, there's a lot of non-verbal cues. Your interviewer cannot see and judge your body language. So being just aware of that. I think at the end of the day, your body cues, they go away, and it's all about you're on camera now. So there's more FaceTime. It's your eyes, your hands, talking with your hands. And, this may seem quite straightforward, but the reality is when I interview some of the senior most human resource seniors within the banks, these are some areas that clearly are differentiating certain candidates from others. Next slide, please. I realize I'm running over, so I'll just quickly speed through these as well. I think, and I mentioned this earlier, I think there's no better time to actually network than now. I think the idea here is no pun intended, but I think the isolation is actually creating a desire to be more connected with others. So networking is important. Be sensitive to cues. I think it's really important that when you are networking, it's not going with the lens that, hey, I'm networking because I want to get a job per se, but it is, it's from the perspective of seeking guidance and also then showing gratefulness, and that will really then lead towards a much more rich connection, a much more informed connection where there is freer flow of information. Recruiting for the future, I think the reality is going to be, obviously there will be more sources, there's more supply, there's more tools to be able to get towards that supply of talent, just being aware of that. There's going to be AI tools in terms of screening applications, in terms of screening candidates. In fact, today even those tools exist. There's certain organizations who candidates actually don't see a physical person until the third interview. So, it's really the digitization of the entire interview process. So there's virtual interviews, sort of going back to the earlier point, as those of you who do interview virtually, be aware of energies, they come through. Virtual interviews as well, pay attention to that, your level of engagement. I think small versus large meetings, there are differences in terms of how to be engaged. It depends also on that. That's well acknowledged. Three main areas I would say is everything has changed, nothing has changed, and empathy. So everything has changed, yes, as I mentioned earlier. For those of us who are planning a type of career, let's get over that. I think it will look very different. And employers, they are waiting on the sidelines. And in many cases, it may appear they're not hiring, but also it's the unknown. So this is a time to make relationships with these organizations. Nothing has changed in terms of what the criteria, the prerequisites are in terms of getting a role. The skill sets are still required. So when you prepare for a virtual interview, it really, my 2 cents are really to prepare with the same vigor as if you're going in person. So preempting interview questions, being well prepared, that really shows through, and it then ties up to the whole concept of energy. And then empathy. I think it's also important, not only as an interviewer, but as an interviewee, that this is a tough time. Not everyone is reacting to it the same way. So understanding that, understanding individuals for who they are, I think, believe it or not, that would also differentiate you, particularly when applying for roles. Next slide, please. So the banking industry, I am very bullish. It will continue to offer roles. It is a complex arena with a variety of disciplines. There's areas within regulation. There's areas within this whole concept of first line of defense. I've talked a lot about the concept of having an opportunity to supercharge technology, working with fintech companies, this fintech tech-fin concept, sustainable finance. The whole idea that the working environment is going to be the new norm, a new working environment. The one other area I would say is there's a big opportunity for online training. I think a lot of the educational institutions are offering discounts. I encourage you, this is a great time to upgrade skills. There are free courses as well, whether it's data analytics, whatever it is that you have an enthusiasm for. And diversity is also something that employers will continue to look for, whether it's gender, whether it's skill set diversity, culture, etc. And I believe the last slide So in closing thoughts, I think my my true message really is obviously health certainly comes first. That is the number one priority. But do use the time to reflect. Do use the time to reset in terms of from your career perspective. For those of you looking for roles, those of you making transitions, I think financial services really, if there's one thing that you take away from my presentation today, it's about being on the supercharged mode and taking advantage of it as well, and staying connected. I mentioned online training. I think also leverage these new modes of communication, whether you use Zoom or Google Meet. I think the reality is that for those of you who have kids, I have my 6-year-old teaching me how to use Zoom sometimes. So, that is something that we all need to become comfortable with. And then banks, they'll be forced to rethink business models, and it remains an attractive destination. I think there will be roles for those of you already in that space who have roles. I think do think very hard about opportunities of reskilling. Those of you who are looking, be aware there are new norms coming up. Stay connected to that. Take advantage of networking opportunities. And at the end of the day, what I would say, and this is based on, again, many discussions with my peers as well, is that talent and diversity, it is no longer a buzzword just for the sake of it. It's an asset, and that's something that will continue to be a feature of the workforce, and leaders are definitely focusing on this asset. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and apologies I've taken a few minutes over, but maybe I'll hand it off for any questions.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. That was very insightful. And we do have a lot of questions. We'll try and take as many as we can. So the first question is from Reba, and she's a chartered accountant who's been on a break for 2 years after getting her baby. So her question is, how does she overcome this and land a job back in banking sector? And I'd like to combine this with another question that you yourself have been an immigrant, and any specific advice that you would have for professionals who have immigrated to Canada and sometimes they may need to restart their career?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great question. Maybe I can sort of start backwards with providing a little bit of insight from my perspective, and then hopefully I can address the question at the same time. So I think what I would say is my experience had been coming to Toronto specifically was this, and I must admit I did come at a much younger age, so I sort of came in at an age where I was going into education, so I was still in my university years. But what I would say is, and I heard it a lot from peers and from even my own parents, etc., is this whole concept of Canadian experience. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation where, on the one hand, you're knocking doors, you've got the skill set. Now, the individual who asked the question is a professional, is a chartered accountant, a rigorous designation to get, world renowned, etc. But yet, you will still get the question, well, you don't have any Canadian experience. So I think this is a classic case where it's trying to understand the system. Again, it's a supply-demand equation, certainly not a personal thing. The reality is when you look at banking, particularly in Canada, it's a little bit of an oligopoly where you have 5, 6, maybe arguably 7 main players, so there isn't that much of a supply, and there are only so many roles. But what I would say is, the way that you get into banking is essentially the points that I touched on earlier, which is, looking at, and it can't be a cookie cutter approach. It really has to be looking at what is the role that you're looking for, what are the skills, that role may be demanding given the environment that we're in. Even though, and I know this is a challenge for many who've spent many years at educating themselves, but I think the reality is now there is an opportunity to retrain and reskill. Stepping back, being able to do that, because number one, not only do you get reskilled in that area, but also I think that shows commitment to the employer as well. So I think I know that's a mouthful there, but I would say that it's not a cookie cutter approach. I think being able to identify the skill gaps for that particular role, very important. Not using a one fit all approach to all the roles that you're applying to is important as well. Networking, speaking to as many people as possible, joining associations, I think, is another one where I would say, you're able to then get a very good perspective from many professionals. So that's what has worked, not only for me but for many of my contacts in that space as well.
Thanks, Rajiv. So we'll ask you one last question before we wind up. So if one does not have professional certifications like CFA or CPA, then what sectors would you recommend are comparatively easier to get a job in the field of finance? And what if someone has a master's qualification added to that?
So the one thing I would say is, and I must admit right up front, I certainly am not, an expert in this space, but I do have a few people in my team who are, which is in the area of data analytics. I think at the end of the day, what we're finding, particularly in banking, where there is a move, to a digitized environment, where data is power at the end of the day. I'm in the investor sales business, so we service institutional clients. The advantage of having data analytics skills, being able to then look, slice and dice information, which provides me as a manager with information which can then be used to either make inferences, come up with certain decisions at the end of the day, is critical. And I think for anyone who really does not have a CFA or a CA, or for that matter, even a master's, I would say being able to even invest in time. I mean, doesn't, I think frankly, gone are the days where, people are looking for necessarily the traditional, the traditional form of training, but it is really more, how can that individual hit the road running, demonstrate execution through previous experience. I think that is viewed definitely sort of in equal weight, if anything. And being able to, and if they don't have that, but being able to invest in that space, to me, at least in banking, I think is certainly something to consider.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Raju. We'll just take one last question. Um, this is from Hari. What would you think about the future of hedge fund accountants in Canada? Do you think there are going to be more opportunities or is it going to be worse?
So I think, look, at the end of the day, in terms of that particular institutional client segment, it is certainly here to stay. That's one of our biggest institutional clients that we service. I mean, the question specific around hedge, if I understood it correctly, was that hedge fund accounting or was that hedge accounting? Just
Hedge
to be
fund accountants.
hedge fund accounts.
Yeah.
So again, that particular client segment is here to stay. We service some of the biggest hedge funds globally. I would say that there's certainly a healthy demand for that client segment. In fact, some of the most innovative structured products are those that are distributed to that client segment. So if you're looking at it from a from a relevance perspective, that client segment is extremely relevant in many regards to this space. So yes, I think that will be definitely an area to consider. But what I would say though is accounting as a whole, though, again, I'm going back to the previous question, some of that is being addressed through fintech, right? So to Hari, I think the question back would be, rethinking some of the expertise that you would have already, how do you actually take that to sort of version 2.0? Think of an environment where an AI tool is performing some form of an accounting, whether it's an accounting policy or whether you're looking at actually automating bookkeeping, your debits and credits, etc. But what is it that is going to be the future of accounting? Put hedge fund accounting aside. So I think perhaps looking at it from that lens would be you'd be able to become more marketable not only to hedge funds but across the industry.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rajiv. This has been very informative, and we got a lot of strategic inputs into how the banking industry and financial industry is moving forward. Thank you once again for accepting our invitation, and we hope to keep hearing from you more often. Thank you once again, Rajiv.
Thank you everyone for joining. Very grateful. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Bye bye.